Dawn broke slowly over Doadorura Airfield on the northern coast of New Guinea, August 17th, 1943. A pale glow crept into the humid tropical sky, revealing a mosaic of mud, steel, and jungle green. The air was thick with the smell of aviation fuel and wet earth from last night's rain. In the half-light, palm fronds stood motionless beyond the airstrip, and a gauze of mist clung to the ground. Technical Sergeant James McKenna crouched beneath the left wing of a P-38 Lightning, his fingers tracing a final check along the landing gear strut. The metal was cool and slick with dew under his touch. Above him, the twin engines of the fighter were silent for now, each housed in a nacelle perched between the cockpit and the tail's twin booms. McKenna could feel his heartbeat in his throat as he glanced toward the cockpit ladder. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was climbing up into the plane, strapping in for a mission at first light. Hayes was just 23, a farm kid from Iowa far from home, about to face another dawn in the sky. Only 6 combat missions under his belt, and not a single enemy kill yet. McKenna watched the young pilot settle into the seat, adjusting his helmet and radio headset, movements stiff with tension. The sergeant swallowed hard. He had seen that mix of determination and dread before. He knew Hayes was heading into deadly odds this morning. Beyond the airfield's perimeter, beyond the coconuts and kunai grass, the enemy was out there. At least 18 Japanese Zero fighters had been spotted on an intercept course for the morning patrol. Hayes and the other P-38 pilots would be flying straight toward them. On paper, the twin-engine Lightning was superior, fast in a straight line, lethal in a dive from a high altitude. Its distinctive twin-boom silhouette now loomed against the brightening horizon, like a predatory bird. But McKenna knew the truth. In a tight turn, against a nimble Zero, this plane could become a death trap. He exhaled slowly, rising to stand by the wingtip as ground crew swarmed around other aircraft in the gray dawn. Ammunition belts were being loaded, fuel hoses detached. Engines coughed and rumbled to life up and down the flight line. But Hayes's Lightning remained still for the moment. McKenna's hand rested on the wing's leading edge. He could feel a slight vibration as Hayes ran through his pre-flight checklist, toggling switches in the cockpit. Just a month ago, McKenna had watched another young pilot climb into a Lightning on this very strip in similar light. That pilot hadn't come back. Hayes might not either, unless the small, forbidden change hidden inside this particular airplane could make the difference. McKenna's jaw tightened at the thought of the modification he'd made in secret only hours earlier. It was a tiny thing. A mere 6-inch length of piano wire now coiled in the left boom, unseen and entirely unofficial. Yet everything rode on that sliver of steel this morning. If it failed, Hayes would likely never leave this jungle alive. If it worked, maybe, just maybe, today would play out differently. McKenna stepped out from under the wing as Hayes signaled readiness to the crew chief. The sun was a red disk now, heaving itself above the horizon. Golden light spilled over the airfield, glinting off aluminum skins and propeller spinners. The cockpit canopy of Hayes's P-38 slid closed with a firm thump. For a brief moment, Hayes looked down toward McKenna through the glass and gave a faint nod. McKenna returned it, fighting to keep his face neutral while anxiety gnawed at his gut. The engines of the Lightning coughed, then roared awake, twin props slicing the air with a growing whine. Exhaust flames flickered blue and orange as Hayes pushed the throttles forward to warm the Allison engines. The sound was deafening in the morning stillness, a sound McKenna had come to know intimately over 8 months of maintaining these beasts. He backed away, raising an arm to shield his face from the prop wash, as the smell of burnt, high-octane fuel joined the morning air. Other lightnings were already taxiing ahead, kicking up rooster tails of red dirt. McKenna's boots sank slightly into the softened ground as he jogged alongside Hayes's plane, guiding him out of the dispersal bay. The nose swung toward the runway. Hayes's P-38 lurched into motion, rolling slowly at first. McKenna fell back, letting the pilot steer onto the packed earth runway on his own. Standing at the edge of the airstrip, McKenna watched the Lightning pause at the threshold, engines idling. For an instant, doubt flickered through the mechanic's mind. Had he done the right thing? The manual said what he'd done was wrong. Worse, it was illegal. He set his jaw and banished the thought. Too late for second-guessing now. At 7:42 hours, Hayes's P-38 began its takeoff roll. The twin engines rose to an ear-splitting pitch as the plane hurtled forward. McKenna's heart thumped against his ribs as he tracked the Lightning's rapid gain of speed. The tail lifted, wheels pounding over ruts and puddles, then the main gear left the ground in a spray of mud. Hayes was airborne, climbing steadily into the morning sky. The silver shape of the P-38 banked gently and joined formation with the other Lightnings circling above the field. Within minutes, the swarm of 17 aircraft set course northwest, toward the haze of jungle and ocean where the enemy waited. McKenna stood rooted in place long after the last speck of them vanished against the blue. Only when the rumble of engines had faded did he let out the breath he'd been holding. Now came the hardest part: waiting. McKenna wiped a smear of grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. His fingers were trembling. He realized he'd been clenching them into fists in his pockets since Hayes took off. In the sudden stillness of the flight line, he felt the weight of exhaustion settle on him. He had not slept at all last night. How could he, after what he'd done? Looking down, McKenna noticed a dark crust of dried blood on his thumb and a matching rust-colored stain on his sleeve. A memory flashed. The slip of pliers, a sharp pain, blood welling while he cursed under his breath. It felt like ages ago, but it was only a few hours. Last night, in the silent hangar, he had broken more than just curfew and regulations. He had taken the P-38's fate and Hayes's life into his own hands. He could still see Lieutenant Hayes as he'd appeared in the dim glow of the maintenance lamps the night before. Hayes had come to him after dusk, long after the day's sorties, when the equatorial heat finally relented into a sticky velvet darkness. McKenna was beneath the wing of that same P-38, wiping oil from a hydraulic line, when he heard hesitant footsteps behind him. He turned to find Hayes standing there, twisting his flight cap in his hands. The kid's face was drawn, eyes haunted by something more than fatigue. At first, Hayes struggled to speak, just shifting nervously on his feet. Finally, he found his voice. "Sarge, is there anything at all you can do to make her roll quicker?" he asked quietly, each word fraught. "I don't care if it's by the book or not. Hayes faltered, then clenched his jaw. "I just need every edge I can get up there." In the hangar's semi-dark, McKenna had taken a long look at the young pilot. The two men stood facing each other amid the smell of machine oil and the ticking sounds of cooling engines. Hayes's hands were trembling at his sides. His eyes had the raw shine of someone who'd seen death too close. McKenna knew exactly what Hayes was asking, and why. Only 3 days earlier, Hayes's wingman and closest friend, Lieutenant Thomas Parker, had gone up on a routine fighter sweep and never returned. Hayes had listened over the radio as Parker's calm demeanor dissolved into panicked screams. Parker had been caught alone in a turning fight with 2 Zeros over the jungle. He'd cried out that his lightning wasn't turning fast enough, his voice breaking with fear. Other pilots had tried to reach him, their shouts overlapping on the radio. Hayes, engaged with another enemy at the time, could do nothing but listen as Parker pleaded for help that wouldn't come. The transmissions had been a nightmare chorus of static, desperate words, then the stutter of machine guns and a final gut-wrenching scream. After that, silence. Parker's P-38 was later found in twisted, burnt pieces scattered across a jungle hillside. There wasn't enough left to bury. That horror lay between the two men now. Hayes didn't speak of it, but McKenna saw Parker's fate in the younger man's eyes. He saw the helpless frustration, the terror barely held in check behind a veneer of duty. Hayes was a good pilot, cautious, disciplined, a stickler for the rules. But out here, following the rules was getting him and his friends killed. McKenna had felt something twist in his chest. He'd watched too many pilots walk out to their planes at dawn, brimming with confidence, only to return in coffins or not at all. Official reports always blamed pilot error. The instructors and manuals insisted the Lightning could outfight the Zero as long as pilots stuck to doctrine, boom and zoom attacks, never engaging in tight turns with the enemy. But McKenna had spent 8 months elbow deep in the guts of these machines. He knew their innards intimately, the controlled chaos of pistons, cables, and hydraulics that kept them flying. He also knew when something was wrong. Under the hangar lights, McKenna heard himself give a quiet, steady reply. "Come back in the morning, Lieutenant. I'll see what I can do." Hayes had stared at him, hope and fear warring on his face. After a moment, he nodded once. "Thank you, Sarge," he whispered. Without another word, he turned and walked off into the darkness beyond the hangar. Alone in the midnight hush, McKenna had stood beside the silent P-38 for a long moment, heart thudding at what he was about to attempt. Outside, the jungle night hummed with the drone of insects. Farther off, faint booms rolled in the distance, distant thunder, or perhaps bombs from a Japanese night raider along the coast. The war never really slept in New Guinea. Even the darkness was alive with its threat. He grabbed a toolbox and a portable lamp and set to work under the plane's left wing, where an access panel on the boom led into the aileron control cables. Kneeling on the hard ground, he unfastened the screws and pried the panel open. The flashlight beam cut into the cramped interior, illuminating dust motes and a maze of wires and pulleys. McKenna reached in and grasped the thick braided cable that ran back toward the tail. This was the aileron control line. When Hayes moved the stick, this cable was supposed to translate that motion to the wing's flaps. Supposed to, anyway. He tugged the cable gently, then harder. It shifted in his hand ever so slightly before going taut. Maybe 3/8 of an inch of give, just as he'd suspected. At full deflection, the system had a hair of slack. Not much at all by any standard measurement, but in a dogfight, that tiny delay between a pilot's stick input and the aileron's response could mean life or death. McKenna had seen it, heard it from the pilots' own mouths. He remembered Lieutenant David Chen limping back on July 9th with bullet holes across his Lightning's left boom, shaken and breathless. Chen had reported a lag in the controls when he tried to roll, just enough delay for a Zero to almost kill him before a wingman intervened. Chen survived that day by a hair, but a few weeks later, flying a different P-38, he got caught in another tight turn fight and never made it home. August 3rd had claimed Captain William Morrison, one of the squadron's most seasoned pilots with 11 kills. McKenna had heard Morrison's panicked voice over the radio that day. His controls felt mushy as he tried to escape 2 Zeros over Oro Bay. The Lightning didn't respond fast enough, and enemy gunfire cut him down. Morrison's plane vanished into the jungle. Later, his crew chief Rodriguez found nothing mechanically wrong in the wreckage. Everything was within spec. The official report called it pilot error, but Rodriguez and McKenna knew better. Standing in that quiet hangar, these memories pressed on McKenna's shoulders like a physical weight. 17 pilots dead in the last 6 weeks, many in scenarios that felt eerily alike. The P-38 just wouldn't respond fast enough in a pinch. Too slow to roll out, too sluggish to escape when a Zero got inside its turn. Command refused to see it. They blamed the men. But McKenna had felt that telltale slack in the cables himself. He had heard the off-note twang when plucking a loose control line during maintenance. In his gut, he knew. The machines had a flaw, one that no amount of pilot training could overcome once they were in the lethal dance of a close dogfight. With a steadying breath, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a short length of steel wire he'd stashed there weeks earlier. 6 inches long, high-tensile piano wire, salvaged from the rudder trim system of a scrapped Lightning that had crashed on landing. He'd kept it as a curiosity at first. Now he realized it was exactly what he needed. Setting the flashlight on an upturned ammo crate to free his hands, McKenna placed the wire against his thigh and took a pair of pliers to it. If he bent it just so into a zigzag Z shape, it could act as a makeshift tension spring. His first attempt went awry. The wire was stiff and springy. It fought the pliers, and his grip slipped. The cut on his thumb had been sudden and sharp. He hissed in pain, shaking out the sting, then wiped the blood on his already filthy coveralls. There was no time to waste. Gritting his teeth, he gripped the wire harder and bent it again, forcing the stubborn steel into the shape he wanted. Finally, after several minutes of wrestling, he had it. A Z-shaped piece of wire that might preload the cable, just enough to eliminate that cursed slack. McKenna forced himself to take a calming breath. His heart was hammering. This was it. The moment he truly crossed the line. If caught, he could be court-martialed for tampering with flight controls without authorization. But if he didn't act, Hayes could be in a coffin by week's end like so many others. He pushed thoughts of consequences aside and crawled halfway into the open panel. The narrow space inside the wing was sweltering, the air thick with the smell of grease and hot metal. Sweat trickled down his temples as he worked one-handed, freeing the aileron cable from its pulley junction. A small steel clevis pin secured the cable's end. McKenna fumbled with it blindly, his shoulder crammed against the metal ribs of the boom. The pin slipped from his slick fingers and tumbled into the darkness inside the wing. "Damn it!" he swore under his breath, freezing as the small metallic clink echoed inside. For agonizing minutes he groped in the void, flashlight casting jittery shadows as he searched. At last his fingertips found the pin wedged in a corner. He exhaled in relief and carefully set it aside. Working deliberately now, he inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley. It was a tight fit. More than once the wire nearly slipped from his grasp as he coaxed it into position. The Z-shape locked in, just barely long enough to span the gap. McKenna retrieved the pin and slid it through the assembly, securing the cable back in place with the wire now in line. His hands were trembling again, but this time with anticipation. This had to hold. He gave the cable a firm tug. The response was immediate. The aileron at the wing's edge twitched at the slightest pull. No slack at all. McKenna felt a cautious thrill. It was perfect. Brushing sweat from his eyes with an oily sleeve, he reattached the inspection panel and tightened the screws. The modification was invisible now, entombed within the boom. No one would see it unless they looked for it. He cleaned the area methodically, wiping away any telltale smudges. If an officer inspected the plane at dawn, they'd be none the wiser. When he finally stood up, his back and shoulders protested from the hour hunched in cramped spaces. McKenna glanced at his watch. 1:15 hours. He had spent the better part of the night on this unauthorized fix. Outside the hangar, the world remained draped in darkness. The generator-powered floodlights cast long shadows across the tarmac. The distant booms had ceased, leaving only the chorus of crickets and the occasional croak of a tree frog. McKenna stepped out from the hangar into the damp night air. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands, inhaling the harsh smoke and letting it calm his nerves. A formation of dark shapes buzzed low on the horizon, probably Japanese bombers on a distant harassment raid, their engine drones a faint tremble on the wind. He wondered if any of the brass in their comfortable quarters even realized mechanics like him were still awake, fighting a different kind of battle in the dead of night. As he stood under the sprawling southern stars, he let the tension in his muscles slowly unknot. Part of him couldn't believe he'd actually done it. He thought of Hayes, likely grabbing a few restless hours of sleep before dawn, oblivious to the gamble McKenna had just taken on his behalf. McKenna took one last drag of the cigarette, then crushed it under his boot and headed wearily for his bunk. Lying on his cot, he found that no sleep would come. He stared at the corrugated metal ceiling of the barracks, listening to the distant cough of a truck engine and the soft snores of other mechanics. His mind replayed every step of the modification, searching for anything he might have missed. What if the wire slipped loose? What if the added tension caused a cable to snap under stress? He pictured Hayes wrestling a suddenly unresponsive plane and felt bile rise in his throat. He had to trust his hands and his instincts. He'd done his best. The rest would be decided in the sky, come morning. McKenna shut his eyes, but the darkness behind his lids only brought images of burning aircraft and the faces of lost pilots. So he waited in a twilight of half-dreams until the first birds began to call from the trees and the blackness outside turned to gray. For McKenna, dawn arrived in a haze of fatigue and steel resolve. Now, only a few hours later, that dawn had given way to open sky, and Hayes was out there in it, putting McKenna's illicit fix to the ultimate test. At 0814 hours, roughly half an hour after takeoff, Lieutenant Hayes's flight of 4 P-38s sighted the enemy over the Huon Gulf. The morning sun was at their backs, turning their high contrails into silver streaks. Below and ahead, a cluster of dark specks, 9, maybe more, skimmed above the cloud tops. Zeros. Hayes's pulse kicked as he flipped the gunmaster switch, arming the 4.50 caliber machine guns and the single 20mm cannon in his nose. He eased back the throttles for a moment, holding formation, as their element leader radioed the sighting to the rest of the group. Bandits at 11 o'clock low, Angels 1-3, crackled the call over Hayes's headset. Immediately, Captain Frank Mitchell, leading their 4-ship element, made the call to bounce. They had altitude and surprise. This was as good an advantage as they'd ever get. Lightning lead to all units. Diving attack, follow me. Pick your targets. Hayes swallowed, mouth dry, despite the cool oxygen flowing into his mask. His gloved fingers tightened on the yoke. Through the plexiglass canopy, the sky was a flawless blue above, while below lay a patchwork of white cloud in the sparkling gulf. It looked deceptively peaceful. Hayes's gut churned with anticipation and dread. This was it. Mitchell's P-38 tipped over first, dropping into a steep dive. Hayes followed immediately, rolling inverted and plunging down after the leader. The other 2 Lightnings in their flight did the same. Within seconds, they accelerated past 300 miles per hour, gravity and engine thrust, hurling them toward the unsuspecting enemy formation. Wind howled against Hayes's canopy, and the airframe shuddered ever so slightly as he pushed the plane faster, past 380 miles per hour. The sun at his back turned his aircraft into a winking, bright dagger aimed at the enemy below. Hayes selected a target, a single zero at the rear of the Japanese formation, slightly separated from the others. As he closed in, details snapped into focus. The green-brown camouflage on the Zero's wings, the vivid red circles of the rising sun on its fuselage. He could even see the enemy pilot's head in the cockpit, oblivious to the danger diving out of the sun. At 300 yards, Hayes centered the Zero in his gun sight and squeezed the trigger. His lightning bucked as all 5 guns erupted. Tracers spewed out in dazzling arcs. The thunder of his own guns was muffled by his helmet, but he felt the vibration rattle through his seat. His first burst went wide, slicing past the Zero's left wing. Hayes corrected, leading the target. He saw a few sparks as rounds clipped the Zero's tail and fuselage. Not enough? The Japanese pilot reacted instantly. In a blink, the Zero's snap rolled hard to the right and pitched down in a diving turn. Hayes gritted his teeth and hauled his P-38 into a matching roll to stay with his prey. In that instant, he felt it. Something different. Instead of the sluggish, heavy lurch he'd come to expect when yanking the Lightning into a sharp maneuver, the plane responded like a live thing. The stick moved, and the aircraft obeyed at once, almost eagerly. Hayes's eyes widened behind his goggles. The controls felt taut, precise. There was no delay, no spongy pause. The Lightning knifed through the turn, rolling 90 degrees in what seemed like half the time it used to take. The sudden nimbleness nearly threw him off. He had over-rotated slightly, not expecting such quick response, but he adjusted in a heartbeat. The P-38 was turning sharper than he'd ever felt it turn. For the first time, he was gaining on a Zero in a horizontal curve rather than losing ground. Hayes dove after the Zero, which now barreled toward the deck to escape. The Japanese pilot likely assumed the heavy American fighter would struggle to follow such a rapid, rolling descent, an assumption that would have been true yesterday. Not today. Hayes stayed right on his opponent's tail, descending through 10,000 feet. A fierce exhilaration built in his chest as the Zero slid back into his sights. At 200 yards, he fired another burst. This time, his aim was true. Tracers chewed up the distance and punched into the Zero's fuselage. Suddenly, the enemy plane blossomed with orange flame. Hayes saw the canopy tear away and a wing shear off as the Zero rolled onto its back, trailing thick black smoke. The burning wreck spiraled toward the emerald jungle below. One down. Hayes had just scored his first kill, but there was no time to celebrate. Break! Break! 3 bogeys, diving on you from above. His wingman's urgent shout crackled in his ears. Hayes instinctively glanced upward through the canopy. The sky above was full of twisting contrails and darting silhouettes now, a full melee. In the blur, he caught the sun glinting off 3 dark shapes plummeting in a shallow dive. Zeros coming fast. They'd seen him destroy their comrade, and now they wanted payback. Hayes's first impulse was to do what doctrine demanded, use the lightning speed, dive away and extend distance, avoid a close-quarters turning fight at all costs. But a cold realization hit. He wouldn't be fast enough. The Zeros already had the dive on him. They'd be within firing range in seconds. Running wasn't an option. His mind flashed to Parker's final frantic cries, caught in a turning fight, begging for help, and then the silence. That was supposed to be his fate now, a P-38 cornered by more agile foes. But Hayes had just felt his aircraft do the impossible. His lightning could turn today, really turn. A steely calm settled over him. If he was going to survive this, he'd have to break every rule he'd been taught. Hayes jammed the throttles forward to their stops. The engines bellowed in response. Instead of continuing his dive to flee, he hauled the Lightning into a sudden left climb, rolling almost onto its back to swing the nose around 180 degrees. The G-forces slammed him into his seat as the aircraft arced up and around. His vision dimmed, graying at the edges for a heartbeat. But through the narrowing tunnel of sky ahead, he felt the P-38 respond with an agility he had never experienced. It was as if the big fighter had shed 1,000 pounds overnight. The lead Zero streaked past beneath him, unable to adjust to the Lightning's unexpected reversal. In a blink, Hayes found himself above and behind that enemy plane. Their roles suddenly reversed. He centered the flitting Zero in his sight and pressed the trigger. Bullets tore into the Japanese fighter's left wing root. The Zero shuddered as its wing crumpled and peeled away. The enemy plane rolled into a dive, cartwheeling end over end while trailing oily smoke. Hayes flashed past it, already scanning for the other two attackers. The remaining pair of Zeros split to either side, zipping by in twin blurs of gray. Hayes rolled level and turned hard left to pursue one. The two enemy pilots, realizing their quarry wasn't trying to flee, pulled their nimble fighters into a tight defensive weave, each trying to drop behind the P-38 from opposite directions. They were attempting a scissors maneuver. Alternating turns meant to force an overshoot. It was a tactic that had always been fatal for Lightnings in the past. Not today. Hayes was already turning inside the path of the Zero on his left, astonished at how sharply the Lightning knifed through the turn. The Japanese pilot tried to reverse direction rapidly, expecting to throw off the heavy American fighter, but Hayes matched him turn for turn. The Lightning's nose swung through the sky with uncanny speed, staying inside the enemy's arc. The second Zero swooped past behind Hayes, unable to line up a shot as the P-38 abruptly changed direction again. Hayes toggled his flaps down to combat setting, bleeding a bit of speed but tightening his turning radius even further. The two Zeros were now separated, each trying frantically to loop onto his tail, but Hayes gave them no quarter. Each time one began to pull lead on him, he was already reversing, his Lightning responding instantaneously to every control input. His breath came in ragged gasps and sweat stung his eyes. The cockpit had become an oven under the tropical sun and the strain of combat. Hayes ignored it all, focused only on the deadly dance unfolding at hundreds of miles an hour. One of the Zero pilots, perhaps rattled by the sight of this twin engine, heavy, matching their every move, made a fatal error. He turned a fraction too hard, bleeding off more speed than he realized. In that moment, Hayes seized the opening. He yanked the yoke and kicked hard on the rudder. The P-38 slid neatly onto the Zero's tail, as if on rails. For a split second, Hayes found himself so close behind the enemy that he could see the yellow flash of the Zero's identification numbers and even a few bullet holes in its rudder. He squeezed the trigger, and his guns converged with a thunderous roar. The burst caught the Zero at point-blank range and ripped it to pieces. The Japanese fighter virtually disintegrated under the hail of cannon and machine gun fire. Shards of metal and bits of wing erupted outward. Hayes's Lightning bucked as debris struck the right engine's boom with metallic thuds. He grit his teeth and flew straight through the cloud of wreckage, heart pounding. The destroyed Zero tumbled out of sight below, already a flaming coffin. That made three enemy fighters down in a matter of minutes. The fourth and last Zero wanted no part of this fight. Hayes caught a glimpse of it above him, already banking away and climbing in a desperate bid to escape. He was low on ammunition and fuel now. Chasing a single, fleeing enemy any farther would be foolhardy. With a mix of relief and triumph, he let the survivor go. Hayes leveled out and took a long, shaky breath. His hands trembled on the controls. The sky around him was suddenly empty, at least for the moment. Even the air seemed eerily still after the furious chaos of those last few minutes. He glanced over his P-38 for damage. The right engine instruments all read normal, despite a few new, ragged holes in the boom. Gingerly, Hayes wiggled the control stick. The lightning still answered perfectly, as if eager for more. He realized he was grinning behind his oxygen mask. "Lightning, 3 to lightning lead. You still with us?" Hayes called into his radio, voice raw but exultant. A crackled reply came back. Captain Mitchell was alive, and so was Hayes's wingman. 2 of their 4 had made it through the melee. The 4th was silent, maybe shot down, maybe limping home elsewhere. Hayes's grin faltered at that thought. There was always a cost. Regrouping with the remaining P-38s above the broken clouds, Hayes peered down in search of any additional enemies. Nothing stirred below but endless blue water and the green blur of coastline. The surviving Japanese fighters had vanished, and no more contacts crackled over the radio. The engagement was over. "Let's go home." Mitchell's voice came through at last. Hayes formed up on his leader's wing. Adrenaline ebbed, leaving him suddenly aware of how drained he felt, and how soaked his flight suit was with sweat. As they set course back south toward base, he allowed himself a final backward glance at the patch of empty sky where, moments ago, he had fought for his life. His mind was reeling. 3 victories in one sortie, unprecedented for him and nearly unheard of in these past grim months. The difference today had been astounding. He flexed his right hand, which was stiff and aching from gripping the controls, and he could still feel how responsive the plane had been, as if that new responsiveness were imprinted in his muscles. Whatever McKenna had done, it had worked beyond his wildest hopes. The strip at Doadorura shimmered in the late morning heat as the first P-38s returned from the mission. McKenna was already standing near the edge of the runway, hands jammed into his pockets, when he spotted a glint in the eastern sky. A lightning emerged from the blue, lining up for approach. As it descended, he could make out the tail number. It was Hayes's plane. Relief and apprehension warred in McKenna's chest. He watched the P-38's wheels chirp down in a billow of red dust. The plane bounced once, then settled, rolling down the strip toward him. Only when it taxied closer did McKenna see the bullet gouges pocking the right boom and the black smears of soot near the exhaust. His heart lurched. Hayes had been in a real fight. That much was clear. The lightning trundled to a stop and ground crew rushed forward. McKenna jogged toward the plane, arriving just as Hayes was popping open the canopy. The young pilot's face was streaked with sweat and oil, his hair plastered to his forehead. He tore off his oxygen mask and helmet, gulping in the heavy tropical air. For a moment, he simply sat there in the cockpit, head leaned back against the seat, eyes closed as if in silent prayer. McKenna climbed up onto the wing and offered a hand. Hayes opened his eyes and grasped it, climbing down unsteadily. Once on solid ground, the lieutenant took a deep breath. His hands were still shaking, and his flight suit was drenched, but he was very much alive. "It worked," Hayes said quietly, looking McKenna straight in the eye. His voice was hoarse and disbelieving, a grin tugging at one corner of his mouth. "Whatever you did, it worked, Sarge." McKenna felt a weight lift off his shoulders that he hadn't realized he'd been carrying all morning. He nodded, swallowing the tightness in his throat. A faint smile cracked his grease-stained face. "Glad to hear it, sir," he managed, keeping his tone even while his insides threatened to burst with relief and pride. All around them, other lightnings were taxiing in, and pilots were clambering out to meet anxious ground crews. Snatches of excited chatter drifted through the humid air, pilots recounting the combat in breathless, adrenaline-fueled bursts. McKenna only half heard the babble. He was still studying Hayes, quickly eyeing the aircraft for any serious damage. Apart from the holes in the right boom and a few fresh dents, the P-38 looked intact. Mechanics swarmed over it now, attending to the engines and hydraulics. Hayes pulled off his leather gloves. His knuckles were white from how hard he'd gripped the yoke. He clapped McKenna on the shoulder in a gesture of thanks that said more than words ever could. There would be a formal debrief soon, but word of Hayes's triumphs spread quickly across the flight line. 3 confirmed kills, people were saying, an almost impossible tally for a single Lightning in one mission, especially one flown by a newcomer. As Hayes walked toward the makeshift operations hut to report in, a knot of fellow pilots formed around him, clapping him on the back and peppering him with incredulous questions. McKenna hung back by the plane, wiping his hands on a rag as the adrenaline seeped out of him, leaving exhaustion and a deep, quiet satisfaction. Captain Frank Mitchell broke away from another cluster of airmen and intercepted Hayes outside the ops hut. Mitchell was a seasoned flyer, tall and sunburned, with a commanding presence. McKenna watched from a distance as Mitchell spoke to Hayes, who responded with a shrug and a glance back toward the flight line, back toward McKenna. A few minutes later, as McKenna stood by Hayes' scarred P-38 inspecting the torn metal on the boom, a shadow fell across his work. He looked up to find Captain Mitchell standing there, flight suit still damp with sweat, face streaked with grime. Mitchell's eyes flicked over the wing and then fixed on McKenna. "You, Sergeant McKenna?" Mitchell asked, voice level, but carrying an undertone of urgency. "Yes, sir," McKenna answered, straightening up, rag in hand. His stomach did a nervous little flip. This could go a number of ways. Mitchell crossed his arms over his chest. "Lieutenant Hayes tells me you might have done something to his ship," the captain said carefully. It was more of an invitation than an accusation. McKenna felt a bead of sweat roll down his back that had nothing to do with the midday heat. He glanced around. The other ground crew were busy with their own task. Safely out of earshot, he cleared his throat. "I made an adjustment, sir." Mitchell's eyebrow inched up. "Explain." McKenna hesitated. This was the moment he had dreaded, but there was no sense dissembling. He stepped closer to Mitchell and kept his voice low. "I added a bit of tension to the left aileron cable, Captain. Took out some slack." Mitchell's expression was unreadable. "How?" McKenna exhaled slowly. "Used a piece of piano wire as an inline tensioner. Installed it last night on my own." For a second, Mitchell just stared. He was a combat pilot, not an engineer, but he understood the gist. A non-standard field modification to the flight controls, highly unauthorized. He glanced toward the bustling crews, then back at McKenna. "You realize that's against about every regulation in the book?" he said quietly. "Yes, sir," McKenna replied, meeting the captain's gaze evenly. "I do." Mitchell studied the mechanic's face for a long moment. McKenna braced for a reprimand or worse, but instead, the captain's sun-cracked face broke into a faint grin. "Damn gutsy thing to do, Sergeant." He paused. "Also damn stupid, if it hadn't worked." A breath of laughter escaped McKenna's chest, surprising him. "Reckon so, sir," he said with a crooked smile. Mitchell's grin widened briefly. Then he turned serious. I saw Hayes's ship out there. I've never seen a lightning move like that. He turned inside those zeros like a damn biplane. The captain stepped even closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. Can you do it to mine? McKenna blinked. He hadn't expected that. You want the mod as well, Captain? Damn right, Mitchell nodded firmly. I lost 4 good men this past month to those Jap fighters. If a piece of wire can keep my boys alive, I don't give a damn what the manual says. McKenna felt a flood of relief and validation. Understood, sir. I can have it done by tomorrow morning's patrol. Make it tonight, Mitchell said, clapping him on the arm. And Sergeant, keep it quiet. McKenna gave a sharp nod. Of course, sir. Very quiet. That evening, long after sundown, a handful of other crew chiefs gathered with McKenna in the back of the maintenance tent. By the glow of a single work lamp, he demonstrated the simple wire trick to them, bending a salvaged length of spring steel into the precise Z-shape. One by one, they nodded gravely and pocketed pieces of piano wire for their own planes. Word of the day's events had spread through the enlisted ranks. Those who could help their pilots were willing to risk a little rule bending to do it. Within a few days, at least 9 P-38 Lightnings at Doadorura Airfield were outfitted with the makeshift tensioner. The effect was immediate and stark. Pilots returned from missions, astonished at how responsive their aircraft had become. What had once been heavy, reluctant machines now felt almost nimble, meeting the zeros on more equal terms. The unofficial modifications spread like a whispered secret. Mechanics from other squadrons heard rumors through back-channel chatter, oversupply convoy rest stops, or from injured pilots passing through field hospitals. A crew chief in the 49th Fighter Group, stationed hundreds of miles west at Guinea, got a tip about tightening the Lightning's reins from a pilot who'd transferred in. Skeptical but hopeful, he tried it on one of his planes. The next mission, that pilot scored his first kill after weeks of frustration. After that, the crew chief quietly rigged 4 more Lightnings the same way. By early September, dozens of P-38s across New Guinea had the secret wire installed. Pilots spoke to each other in cautious tones, comparing notes on how their aircraft now handled. Some didn't know exactly what their crew chiefs had done, only that their Lightning suddenly felt right, alive in their hands. Others knew and kept their mouths shut around the brass. Inspections became a cat-and-mouse game. Ground crews would remove the wire tensioners before any scheduled maintenance checks, then slip them back in afterward. Nobody wanted the higher-ups catching on too soon. The results were impossible to hide for long. Kill-to-loss ratios in the P-38 units began to climb radically. In July, the Lightning squadrons had lost 2 aircraft for every Japanese zero they shot down. By late August, the numbers were nearly even, and by September, the Americans were finally getting the upper hand. Pilots who had once resigned themselves to running or dying in close dogfights now found they could stand and fight. The Japanese noticed almost immediately that something had changed. Their once reliable tactics were failing. Even veteran Japanese aces found themselves nearly outturned by Lightnings, an unthinkable scenario just weeks before. Before long, Japanese command began cautioning their fighter units. Avoid the Lightning unless you have a significant numerical advantage. That directive marked a turning point. The fearsome Zero, former master of the turn fight, was now being outmaneuvered often enough to put its pilots on the defensive. The hunters were becoming the hunted. It was not until October 1943 that the secret finally reached official eyes. During a routine maintenance inspection at Doadorura, a sharp-eyed Air Force engineering officer noticed something odd. A few P-38s had unusually high control cable tension, tighter than factory spec. He dug deeper and discovered the little wire tensioners hidden in the mechanisms. A formal report was drafted, and suddenly the chain of command was buzzing. By the time the report landed on a colonel's desk, the Pacific kill ratios spoke for themselves. Lightning pilots were returning alive in greater numbers, and Japanese adversaries were falling from the sky at rates unheard of earlier that year. The modification was clearly saving lives. Still, it was an embarrassing breach of protocol. For a few weeks, memos flew between far-flung island bases and the Air Force Materiel Command back in the States, debating what to do. Court-martial the mechanics for violating regulations, or quietly acknowledge the ingenuity and make it standard procedure. In November, Lockheed Aircraft dispatched a small engineering team to New Guinea to evaluate the field modification. The engineers, huddled with grease-stained crew chiefs, examined the piano wire fixes and ran test flights. Their verdict was unequivocal. This simple tweak transformed the P-38's handling for the better, with negligible downside. By December, Lockheed was already incorporating an approved version of a cable tensioning spring into the new P-38J models coming off the production line. Officially, the improvement was attributed to a routine design refinement. Unofficially, those in the know understood it had been born on a sweltering tropical airstrip, in the hands of enlisted mechanics driven by necessity and raw insight. No official commendations ever came for the piano wire trick. The war moved too fast, and perhaps pride got in the way. McKenna never received a medal, nor a mention in any official history for his quiet act of rebellion. But in hushed conversations and off-the-record briefings, commanders acknowledged that a handful of resourceful crew chiefs had changed the course of the air war in their corner of the Pacific. Lieutenant Robert Hayes went on to fly 63 combat missions by the end of World War II. He achieved 11 aerial victories in total, becoming an ace many times over. He survived the New Guinea campaign, the Philippines, and even the final pushes over the Japanese home islands. When he returned to Iowa in late 1945, he married his high school sweetheart and raised 4 children. Every year, without fail, on the anniversary of that August 17th mission, Hayes picked up the phone and called James McKenna. It was the same call, year after year, a heartfelt thank you to the man who, as Hayes would plainly say, saved my damned life. Captain Frank Mitchell continued to lead his squadron with distinction. With the Lightning's new edge, he and his pilots dominated the skies through the Philippines and beyond. Mitchell ended the war with 16 kills to his name. He stayed in the Air Force after 1945, rising to the rank of colonel before retiring in 1963. For decades, whenever he mentored young maintenance officers, he recounted the story of a sergeant with a piece of wire who outthought the rule book. He made sure the next generation understood that sometimes the best solutions come from the ground crew, from the men on the line who see problems others overlook. As for Technical Sergeant James McKenna, he finished out his tour in New Guinea in 1944 and mustered out of the service in 1946. War's end found him back in California, working with engines again, only now it was cars instead of planes. He opened a modest auto repair garage in Long Beach in 1948 and spent the next 40 years fixing automobiles with the same steady hands that once tended Lightnings. Neighbors and friends knew him as a quiet, skilled mechanic who never boasted about his past. If pressed, he'd mention he'd been an aircraft mechanic in the war, nothing more. Years turned into decades. The war that had defined McKenna's youth faded into sepia photographs and history books. It wasn't until 1991 that a military historian, researching forgotten aircraft modifications of World War II, stumbled across cryptic references to an unofficial cable tensioning device in old maintenance logs. Intrigued, the historian tracked down James McKenna, then 73 years old and still working part-time at the very same garage he'd opened so many years before. In the back office of that unassuming garage, surrounded by the comforting odor of motor oil and old tools, McKenna recounted the tale over a cup of coffee. He spoke plainly, with the same modesty that had kept him from seeking attention all those years. Yes, he confirmed, the story was true. He had done what needed doing, nothing special in his view. He seemed slightly bemused that anyone found it remarkable. The historian later calculated that McKenna's little wire likely saved between 80 and 100 American pilots' lives, judging by the sharp drop in casualties once the fix took hold. McKenna merely shrugged at the estimate. He said he never kept track of numbers. He only remembered the faces of the young men who came back. James McKenna passed away in 2006 at the age of 88. He was buried quietly in California, his headstone noting his service as an Army Air Forces mechanic. It made no mention of the indelible mark he left on the air war. In that Long Beach garage office, a faded black and white photograph still hangs on the wall. It shows a young man in oil-stained coveralls standing beside a P-38 Lightning, squinting in the bright August sun. On the back, in faint pencil, are the words, Doadorura Airfield, 1943. It's a glimpse into a moment when an ordinary sergeant changed the course of many lives with a simple act of ingenuity. It speaks to how wars are often won not just by generals and famously named aces, but by the quiet heroes on the ground, those who see a problem and, without waiting for permission, set out in the dark to fix it.